Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for coming. For those of you that chose to view this session, thank you. For those of you that your other sessions were full, I won't hold it against you. It's fine. I hope it will be interesting. I'm here to talk to you today about rebuilding the Devnet developer platform as a cloud application or as multiple cloud applications. I'm Matt Johnson. I'm a developer evangelist. Actually, that's the first mistake of my presentation. I meant to change that statement to something less sarcastic. But regardless, so two things you need to know before we begin for a bit of context. First of all, who am I? And secondly, what is Cisco Devnet? So, as I said, my name's Matt Johnson. I'm on Twitter there. I'm a developer evangelist at Cisco. Now, don't worry, this isn't a sales talk. I think I've got one picture of a router somewhere in this presentation, and it's used ironically. But I come from very much the ops side of DevOps. I've historically been a security, Linux, SRE style role. And pretty much my career path seems to have been solving deployment problems for people. How we deploy software seems to have chased me into whatever role I've taken. So 5 years ago, we were deploying apps using Solaris zones for isolation. 3 years ago, I was using Jenkins to automate Cloud Foundry deployments as code. 2 years ago, we were creating, a usable container stack using Mesos Marathon and kind of configuring all the different bits that Kubernetes now has as standard into it, like load balancing and service discovery, to make it usable for developers. And obviously now it's all the Kubernetes all the time, because why wouldn't you? That's why we're here. It's just such a good, thriving out-of-the-box solution. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we're doing with Kubernetes and Cisco Devnet. So next question, what is Cisco Devnet? Devnet is Cisco's developer evangelist platform. It's basically designed to be the one-stop shop if you are a developer, if you need to understand any of Cisco's APIs, if you're a partner, if you're a customer, if you're just a startup or a member of the public that's looking to use some of our products, be it collaboration, be it our hardware, be it our SaaS services. It's meant to be a one-stop shop, a single resource for everything developer at Cisco. Okay? So that includes, as you can imagine, a number of different areas all under this single developer.cisco.com landing page. Things like the Learning Labs. So Learning Labs are self-paced, step-by-step tutorials, hands-on tutorials that are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on our developer portal. And these go through all kinds of different things. So they are basically self-service learning. So they might be curated into a track for a specific, here's how you use APIs to configure or do, solve a problem with some Cisco hardware, some Cisco software, some Cisco APIs. You can then drill down into the individual modules if you already kind of know what you're doing, but just looking for the specific API demos or to answer a specific problem, or the individual labs. So labs go into modules, modules make up tracks. You do as many or as few as you want. And the idea of this isn't just to have documentation. The idea of this is to go, here is a 10, 20, 30-minute demo, hands-on, and by the end of it, you will have actually used and solved the problem using these APIs, rather than just giving you a load of API documentation with no context. And it's not just Cisco skills. This is something that really excites me about Devnet in general. Our customers to Devnet are not just people looking at Cisco APIs. We aim to be this one-stop shop for all things developer at Cisco. So, Cisco internal staff that are looking at, how to get into this new kind of API-driven, software-defined world will come to us to kind of look at, maybe outside of their comfort zone. We have the public coming to us because, we have all the prerequisite skills as Learning Labs as well. We're not just going to dump you into a Learning Lab going, use this REST API. We'll have a Learning Lab about what is a REST API, what is JSON, Python 101, Docker 101. So that really excites me. It's not just Cisco products and tooling, it's just a general, solution-focused place to do hands-on learning. Another part of Devnet is the Sandbox. Again, really, really exciting. It's a virtual environment with real infrastructure. So the Devnet Sandbox allows you to basically reserve an entire solution. So let's say you're doing a learning lab, let's say you're a startup that's looking to leverage some APIs to add, partner value to one of Cisco's products, or just use us for our messaging or our, collaboration APIs. You can effectively use the Sandbox to test out in the real world against our real production systems your code, your tools, or if you're learning, you can use it as effectively a CCIE or a training lab if you're still very much a network engineer. But the Sandbox basically gives you always-on labs, which are just kind of access to certain APIs from our products, and that's usually used for our learning labs to give you somewhere to learn against with those hands-on scenarios. But also reservation-based labs, and we are talking, potentially hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars worth of Cisco equipment configured in a certain design that if you're trying to validate something against a real-world environment, you can reserve a sandbox for free and effectively do all your development for kind of 5-7 days within that sandbox, rather than having to acquire or borrow or beg or steal or touch a production system yourself with that equipment in it. So Sandbox is very cool. Learning labs kind of love that it's kind of a mixture of Cisco and general learning for kind of where the industry's going. As well as that, obviously, overviews, API references. It's a community. It's quite a big community now of people on the blogs, getting started videos, support forums, and we also do kind of virtual and events on Twitter. And physical events like our first Devnet Create conference, which is actually coming up in San Francisco in a couple of months' time. But as you can imagine, all of this didn't happen overnight. As Devnet grew, Devnet used to just be an idea like we really need something more developer-centric that people can go to, rather than, I don't know if you ever looked at Cisco's like cisco.com documentation site, not what a developer wants to see. Not what anyone wants to see unless you want to read a 300-page PDF, to be honest with you, in some cases. But as you can imagine, this all grew quite organically. So our original Devnet portal was static content, blogs, items for things you could read. And then we realized that learning labs and interactive learning would be a really good idea. But the Devnet portal was already running on a third-party system. Someone else within the team, the fledgling team of Devnet, had set that up. So Learning Labs got hosted somewhere else because the original provider didn't quite do what we were trying to do with Learning Labs. So suddenly you have another section in another location. You've got this other product effectively under this umbrella of Devnet. And suddenly you need to start doing your own content management, your own database, your own logging and metrics, because it's a separate siloed piece. Then we have Sandbox. Sandbox, again, different challenges than the static content or the learning labs, because we're actually dealing with real hardware environments that we configure and reset after each reservation. So again, that had to be somewhere else. That was a completely new build. And yes, you can do SSO authentication, but each of these different things are still going to have its own content management, its own reservation system, for example, in Sandbox. And so as you can imagine, these are spread across many locations, being built and deployed at different times through Devnet's history, and are all a little bit different. We've done our best to create kind of a single UX across them, with one logging into the other with tokens or hyperlinks or whatever we can do. We've tried to make sure the CSS is consistent across all of them, but it is a bit of a pain. And this is where we were. So we were realizing that the more of these systems we had to actually make Devnet better, to have all these extra features, was causing a lot of operational replication. So in terms of onboarding a new member of Devnet staff, for example, making sure they actually had the RBAC roles in all these different systems, even though the SSO, the sign-on was shared, authentication systems were different, profile storage systems were different. There was a lot of duplication of information on the back end between all of these separate systems, which caused a headache for management, caused a headache for troubleshooting. In terms of customers and our customers to Devnet noticing things like this, mean time to change was the main problem. Some of our systems were hosted by a third party on a third party content management service. Their priorities didn't line up with our priorities. But if the piece of Devnet that you wanted to change happened to be old enough to be on that solution, that bit might take 6+ weeks to get a change through. And obviously that didn't line up with what we're trying to do for kind of easy access to all of this documentation and stuff within Cisco. And also, finally, we had expanding needs. You know, the sandboxes, the learning labs, the playgrounds were becoming really, really popular. We needed to scale those out, potentially put them in different regions. We were asked to do more and more events and innovation showcases, so suddenly we needed to manage, pardon me, suddenly we needed to manage registration for hackathons. We needed to provide infrastructure for those hackathons, you know, specific learning labs for those events. So just more and more things we needed to integrate with. So we effectively had this goal. You know, Devnet is our product. You know, we're not a sales-aligned team. You know, this isn't just a thing that all the sales teams kind of contribute to. Devnet, the ability for developers to come and learn, be it Cisco products or otherwise, the ability to have this one-stop shop, that is our product. So we wanted to improve the experience for all Devnet users by taking more control over our product. This is what we care about. This is what we're passionate about. And we want to do that by reducing complexity and producing testable, consistent output, not lots of different pieces in lots of different places. And if we can do that, we can then have a solution which we can easily extend and also confidently stand by our SLAs. And it might not sound much, developer portal, it's free, who cares? But no, the SLAs are really important. You know, as I said, this is our product. So if we are expecting people within Cisco or outside of Cisco from a BU or from a product to donate a learning lab or donate content to us, you know, they expect a level of service from the platform on which they're creating that content. They are not going to put the effort in to create a really good learning lab only for it to be down more time than it's up. You know, and it's hard to achieve that unless we have you know, as much control as reasonably possible over the dependencies down through the stack. You know, so the learning lab content creator isn't going to keep creating content for us unless we are reliable. The people consuming the learning labs, the portal, in fact, everything on Devnet, you know, are not going to keep coming back if it's flaky and it's slow and it's not working properly. There can be people in Cisco, app devs, infra dev, you know, all of these people that come to Devnet. The only SLA I actually care about is this one. It's the users doing whatever they want on our platform. But unless we have reasonable control over all of the other pieces down there, the users don't care what broke, they just know that something broke. So as much reasonable control as we can of the SLAs up and down our stack. So we wanted something that looked like this. We wanted to get rid of the replication that we were doing in terms of user profile and storage and things like that. We wanted to get rid of all these different environments with their own build tools that have grown up over the years, you know, roll that into a single CI/CD pipeline, a single set of authorization and authentication, a single place for logging, metrics, analytics, both for the system itself and obviously for what our users were doing, so we can provide feedback and you know, usage statistics and things like that. And all of these, if we were all in one place, could be a single set of reusable services. Now we're at KubeCon, so obviously the container management system is going to be Kubernetes. I have a lot of experience, as I said, with other schedulers, with other ways of deployments. We used to be a big Mesos marathon shop, but the reality is that the speed and development of Kubernetes, the integration in a pluggable way of things like ingress controllers, services, you know, the storage work that's going on, the RBAC work especially was a big bugbear for us with, you know, with our experience with Mesos and Marathon. You know, the speed of Kubernetes development against things that actually solve problems for us on the ops side of the business is just too big a benefit not to consider, right? So obviously that's Kubernetes, and the idea is that we would basically combine everything I've just shown you, everything I've just talked about in what is Devnet, the portal, the learning, the sandbox, you know, everything we can into applications on top of this cluster. Okay, and that'd be all wonderful, and it'd be all great, and then we'd have one system to manage and worry about, and everything would be peachy. And so we had to start somewhere, and I'd love to say that it was all done and finished, but this is actually a pretty new move for us. So what we've actually got to so far are the bits in green in this middle section. You know, you've got to start somewhere. We're being honest. This is a journey we've just started. The cluster is up, the hosting providers are up. The first two actual components we've moved across to this system are the user profile service. Makes sense to start there. Everything is pretty much going to depend on it anyway. And something called gamification. And that was really a requirement in our backlog we've had for Devnet for a while, but it made sense because it was a greenfield piece to write that at the same time to prove out using our new system and using our new user profile service. So gamification, for anyone that's not heard of the idea, is the idea of kind of giving users a, almost like a game-style level-up feeling. Why should they keep on playing? Why should they keep coming back? Why should they keep learning? And so it's just a way to encourage and tie all of the parts of Devnet together, be it physically attending one of our events or doing a physical lab in one of our events, to doing learning labs, to accessing the sandbox. And we're basically tying that back into giving the user badges and awards for what they've done within the Devnet ecosystem. And that might translate to physical or virtual prizes in the near future, but for now it's actually just tracking and awarding badges. So as a quick demo, I say demo, I'm going to go to a website. This is the developer.cisco.com portal. This is the kind of front end. And the new profile service and the new gamification service running on Kubernetes can be seen if you click on My Account. So this is new, and if you go to your dashboard, that's annoying. Thank you very much. Let me go back. Good at Kubernetes, bad at split screen. Okay, cool. So again, this is the developer Cisco portal. This is our kind of front page, access to everything Devnet has to offer. And the gamification service and the profile service, if you go to My Account, this is new. And we basically have a dashboard per user now. So hello, these are the learning labs I've done. These are the tracks and modules I've completed. And if I view my achievements, I'm a very lazy Devnet member. I've only achieved one badge. But you can see that badge is there because I've done certain learning labs or I've attended certain events. And again, we can start putting prizes and awards to these potentially later on. But to start with, we needed a service to actually collect these from all parts of Devnet. And we do that through webhooks. So the gamification service effectively receives webhooks from learning labs or from physical events, from check-in or sign-in at a physical event, and effectively then stores via the user profile service what the user's done, what the user's successfully completed, et cetera, so we can do something with that in the future. Told you it was a small demo. Right, back to this. And I don't have kubectl set up for production on this laptop, so screenshots will have to do, but you can see that those services, kind of the new UI that you saw there for the profile, the user profile management service, and the gamification service that's receiving those webhooks and interfacing with UPM, they're all running on our Kubernetes cluster under the devnet.cisco.com domain, which is automatically configured through our Kubernetes controllers, etc. And that's all really good, right? User profile service, done. Everything can now integrate with it. In fact, even the old legacy stuff is now effectively using that for profile lookup. So, the more pieces we move there, it doesn't mean you can't start taking advantage of them until everything. A slowly approach for this kind of stuff really, really works. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where it's hosted, Kubernetes or what or not. If you know you're planning to move everything over eventually, start consuming from there, with these small services. So that's absolutely great because UPM is just code, it's just business logic with a database at the back end. Gamification service, really simple service, just webhooks and processing, okay? And that's great, but it's, no one is in a perfect greenfield scenario. And everyone will be like, oh yeah, like you're just telling me to create new microservices and host them on Kubernetes. No, it's a problem, No one has that luxury of being able to start fresh with everything. There's always outliers. There's always things that don't quite fit in these wonderfully nice round holes. And a fine example for us is Sandbox. So Sandbox has this UI that lets you pick the sandbox you want to reserve. Great. We can definitely move that into a little microservice on our Kubernetes cluster, using the authentication, using the login, using all those shared services, reduction of complexity. Reservation system, great. Well, we have to do events and hackathons, and they need people reserving things as well. So a reservation service can definitely be used here. Again, reducing the number of repeat components across these estates. So that's okay. Remote access. I don't know if any of you were in the keynotes yesterday with the Google Kubernetes product roadmap. The kind of cloud console that she was using to kind of give you secure remote access to internal systems via the web. That's a way we can give people access to the devices in these sandboxes. And again, that's just, some WebSockets and some JSON. That's definitely hostable. The labs, however, are a problem. Some labs are okay. Some of the sandboxes are purely SaaS-based. The APIs are online anyway, so Tropo, WebEx, Meraki. It's all just SaaS APIs. We don't actually need a physical lab. The UCS emulator is actually just a Java application that emulates the state machine of UCS. So again, we could containerize that lab. That's not a massive problem. This is a problem. This is one of our ACI labs. So this is a full networking topology made out of real hardware that you can reserve for about 7 days. And obviously, I know that the whole theme of this conference has been Kubernetes loves something. But Kubernetes doesn't love big pieces of iron that do like 10 gigabit switching. You cannot put one of those in a pod, I am afraid. But it doesn't massively matter, we found. There's still, originally when we started this vision, we're like, Sandbox cannot fit into that picture. What are we going to do about this? There's no, we can't do that. Do we, and it was a real stumbling block for us kind of thinking around how we want to do this. But actually, it doesn't matter that the Sandbox is bare metal, because everything else around it, the UI, the reservation, all of that stuff, that's still massively reducing complexity of what we have to manage outside our new environment. It can still make use of those shared services. They both require reservations, they both require X, Y, Z. It doesn't matter that it's hardware, because we can even move some of the stuff we have to do when a user reserves a lab. So resetting those devices, okay? Reconfiguring them back to the baseline so that the new lab user doesn't have the old lab user's settings and it's nice and fresh and clean. We can actually move that like a single run job into a Kubernetes worker. It's already got the cloud console for access to those devices that we're hosting in there. So why not put all the actual management and resetting a lab into there? Again, massively reducing the complexity of this other environment out here. So yes, we can't move the hardware in, but we can slowly move all the supporting players and all the kind of bits of business logic around making that a useful lab into a place that's a lot more manageable and can share these services. So once we realize that, once we realize there were still benefits to gain, you're never going to get everything inside. But if you reduce the complexity of the moving parts outside, you're still in a good situation. And for other businesses without hardware labs, I guess that is kind of true of OSS and BSS systems within your business, right? Just because some of your new components or some of your new product lines are going to be kind of Kubernetes-based, OSS, BSS systems that you have to integrate within a large enterprise are going to take time to catch up, and that's fine. I'm sure you've seen it at this conference today, past 2 days, using kind of things like Linkerd to kind of minimize failure of your systems from third-party dependencies. It's fine if you can't get everything in here immediately, but reduce the complexity for the pieces at least you are responsible for, and you'll reap the benefits. So because we're at KubeCon, I'm not going to show you a picture of how we've done this. What does our cluster look like? Because no one cares, right? Most people's Kubernetes deployments look the same as everyone else's Kubernetes deployments. You have some workers, some masters, some plugins for whatever ingress controllers you're using. So I'm not going to go into that. I am just going to do some highlights just for what we are doing on the background. We're currently running all this in GC and AWS. We're not using GKE. We're using VM instances in both cases, so it's kind of exactly the same Kubernetes that we deploy across both. Currently using service load balancers back to the cloud providers, just for TCP load balancing, and then we're using our own Nginx pods for HTTPS reception. We know that's a bit backwards, Ingress and Linkerd, having Ingress support in the next Linkerd release is really interesting. For those not familiar with Ingress, it's effectively a HTTP layer 7 or layer 5 load balancer, Linkerd would say. But it means that you effectively don't have to have your application developers worry about that Nginx layer for terminating their SSL. There's also some really good public open source tools already being created for automatically registering public-facing DNS and automatically provisioning Let's Encrypt valid SSL certificates for a new Ingress controller. The project's called KubeLego, cs.co/Kate's Let's Encrypt. I did a blog post about this actually. Documentation for combining the DNS and the Ingress stuff's a bit thin on the ground, so I put the steps there. And that's really cool because it basically means that developers can deploy an Ingress controller. They don't have to worry about the SSL offload. They don't have to worry about Nginx. They deploy their application as HTTP. And if they want that public with a couple of annotations on that ingress controller definition, they get valid browser certificates, they get registered DNS against your, Devnet branded domain name, and that's really cool. And then for people wondering how we're doing the CI/CD, we've got a bit of a love for drone.io as a CI/CD tool within our team. So all of our CI/CD pipelines for anything going into this new platform are drones-based. We're currently deploying Kubernetes across both locations with Cargo, which is a open source, it's part of the Kubernetes repos. It's just a load of Ansible and other bits for deploying Kubernetes installations. We're watching that migrate to kind of using kubeadm pretty closely. kubeadm, by the way, shout out to the cluster ops SIG, is a wonderful way for deploying Kubernetes now. Cargo is a little bit behind in that respect, and there's kind of talk of the unification of those two, which we're quite looking forward to from making our operations life easier. In terms of components we're using then to manage the cluster, what we're doing for our kind of analytics of who's using Devnet, all these shared services I was talking about, we're trying to standardize around CNCF components. Why wouldn't you? The community's great. They're all kind of, CNCF I've always thought has been really good at curating kind of one item in each problem space. Not going to comment on Rocket versus Containerd. That seems to break that mold. But yeah, where we can, kind of Prometheus, obviously Kubernetes, where we can, we're kind of trying to standardize on CNCF. And then across both of our installation bases, we're giving our developers two options, Cassandra and Postgres, that our cluster operations team are managing. They don't have to use those. We're not saying you have to use these, but we're basically giving two supported database types to each DevOps team to consume as a service. The plan is in the next release of Kubernetes, we'll have those automatically provisioned via the service broker work you might have seen over the past 2 days. So that's the plan there. If the individual teams for the individual services, they're, in a DevOps model, if they want to go and use and support their own database services, that's up to them. But these are just the two we're kind of offering as an easy get-going solution. So that's kind of where we are, a very honest view of where we are. We've got a long way to go, but I just want to talk about some next steps, which are quite interesting to me, and just kind of where we're thinking. Now we've started this journey, now we're committed to moving all this stuff over, some next steps. So the need for multi and hybrid deployments. We are currently in the process of putting a small amount of our services, replicating them to a Cisco IT cluster. Again, it'll be our same Kubernetes setup. We're just using VMs or we're just using hardware from Cisco's internal data centers to keep everything consistent. But we are moving a small subset of the services to run side by side within Cisco. Why hybrid multi? Why do that if we've already got GCE, we've already got AWS? So the great thing about not quite having finished your slide deck is you can use great things you hear from the first day of the conference. So thank you very much. But hybrid, multi, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't really matter, does it, which one it is? It's the same thing, having multiple instances regardless of where they are. It's great for all these reasons: improved security, increased performance, availability, all blah, 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 blah. But for us, there was also a very real reason why when people were saying, are you just putting something in Cisco IT to say you have something in Cisco IT? No. Cisco has adopted like a completely cloud agnostic angle. We're quite happy saying we run on GCE and AWS and nowhere else if that was what we needed. But for us, we had a specific use case. We didn't want to make the Devnet product a burden on our internal users. We didn't want them having to use Devnet to provide external people their public API documentation and then have to use some other document management tool to also store their internal documentation, because we're effectively asking developers to then double their workload in documentation just to support Devnet. So we have one of these services called PubHub. I've not covered it. It's basically a document repository integrated with Git. So developers were asking us they'd like to update documentation as code. So it's basically a pipeline that Git submissions, Markdown, turns into HTML for the website and for the public interfaces, but also searchable and trackable as Git. You can tag documents with either public or private. And it's the public and private bit that was interesting, because we want them to use this for their documentation. We don't want them to repeat their workloads. And actually, you'll find that as a product gets older, or as the release becomes more mature, actually most products, more private developer documentation becomes public documentation, as that product matures. And so we didn't want those to be in two different places. But we do have very strict rules on confidentiality within Cisco, within the existing business policies, and so we couldn't store some of that documentation out on AWS or GCE. Now, those policies may change in the near future, everything's kind of moving to cloud, but for now we had to work within those confines. So the ability for us to just deploy Kubernetes, to put the needed services internally for PubHub storage, for everything else, but still consume the public services for the profile management and all that, is actually already a win for moving to this kind of single platform model and these reusable services. Because instead of having to do a separate internal PubHub, which doesn't solve this problem, we can just have them use the PubHub pieces that are locally within Cisco's network. The second thing I'm quite excited about is K8s as a safe playground. I don't know if any of you have heard of playwithdocker.com. Hands raised? No? Basically gives you a VM. It's a fake VM, it's actually Docker in Docker, but gives you a VM with a terminal window in a web page with Docker installed. And so you can do all of your Docker demos, Docker run, we actually use it in our learning lab to save us having to host a Docker environment. It's open source, you can host it yourself, and it gives a wonderful experience to playing and learning Docker. And we want to be able to do the same for Kubernetes. We basically want to have Kubernetes learning labs, or have other things, other services built on top of Kubernetes, without those people having to have their own Kubernetes cluster. And so what we're thinking is something like this. We're thinking of, and we're in the process of doing this. We're going to open source it when it's ready as an application. The idea of having an API for requesting playground access. It then goes and sets up a namespace, uses the new RBAC stuff, creates a user, locks them into that namespace, and also applies network policy to mean that ephemeral namespace has limited outbound access. So kind of, if this is public on the internet for anyone to use, like a first do no harm. We don't want them turning it into kind of, another node in a botnet. So limited outbound access, but enough to learn Kubernetes and enough to use the applications that we might deploy as demo applications within that cluster. And then also the service will keep an eye on it, maybe timed after 24 hours, it will rip down the namespace, maybe subscribe to the events from the Kubernetes API, so you can actually give the user back a list of the API calls they made to Kubernetes, which they can keep for their own learning or their own information. So this idea of effectively, play with Docker, play with K8s, and actually if you think about it, combine this with pre-seeded containers for some of the different CNCF or Devnet products and services. It could be play with CNCF. So you could use this as a basis for then, actually, I want to understand Prometheus, or I want to understand Linkerd. And the user could ask for a Linkerd playground that gets this, but preceded with a Linkerd application setup, for example, which would make a wonderful learning lab. So this is something I'm working on and quite passionate about, because I want to make this available for more people to get into Kubernetes more easily. And this comes into this, which a colleague of mine, Ken Owens, is leading, CNCF integration. At the moment, CNCF has a massive POC cluster, okay, for scale and performance testing of the CNCF projects. But it's got no developer experience capability. It's meant for people stress testing one of the CNCF projects. So there's a GitHub ticket for access. They then stand you up a bare metal as a service offering once you've requested access. It's difficult to get going. It can take a long time. What we'd like to do is take what I've just showed you and integrate that with the CNCF cluster. So this idea of kind of play with CNCF technologies using this kind of Kubernetes locked namespace as a service integrated with the CNCF performance and testing cluster. And I think that would give a really good starting point for a lot more of these learning lab style always on solutions online. We're also considering CNCF certifications as part of Devnet. Obviously, it's very hard to get someone to play with Kubernetes unless they have somewhere to play with Kubernetes, so this all kind of ties in. And And this is not at all a leak or a secret thing, or this is not happening, but we do have an intent to discuss with Cisco internally whether, you know, the CNCF offerings and the way that the software landscape is going, should that impact on any of Cisco's existing certifications. We've not had that conversation yet, but it's something we intend to do. You know, do CCNPs, do CCIEs in cloud need to actually start to understand some of this stuff? Is that going to be beneficial to their certification? Is that going to be beneficial to their career? And the final thing before I let you go is we're also looking at what Cisco actually has to offer for the Kate clusters that our operations team now has to run. So things like security. You know, this is within Devnet. We're actually looking at integrating OpenDNS, which is a secure DNS provider, into our Kubernetes nodes. So that kind of indications from compromise, from weird outbound DNS, prevention of access to unknown bad locations from the containers based on DNS lookups. We need to start working with the security SIG for this, because there's some things we need, like unique namespaces. You know, a lot of the benefits of this will depend on tying the deployment and pod identity to the DNS lookups. So that's something we're looking into, but you know, there's some really cool things we can do in the security space already at Cisco, and they're all cloud-based, and they could lend themselves really well to protecting and adding extra layers of security to our clusters. So that's a brief look at Kubernetes and Devnet and cloudification and where we're going. I hope it was interesting. Any questions? If you don't have time now, I'm on Twitter at Matt-J. And yeah, thank you very much for your time.